Hello, everyone. My name is Don Gips. I'm the CEO at the Skoll Foundation. And I'm so excited to welcome you to this session on harnessing capital markets for sustainable impact. I want to share a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. The session's being recorded. Please feel free to use the chat to engage with each other and ask questions of the speakers. The session is scheduled to end in 90 minutes. After the session, please take a few seconds to complete the single question feedback survey in the poll tab to the right of the video screen. On social media, we are using the hashtag @SkollWF and would love for you to do the same. We are so thrilled to be able to include this year's session in the virtual Skoll World Forum, and want to extend a special thank you to Capricorn Investment Group for proposing and designing it. Jeff Skoll created an innovative portfolio of philanthropic and commercial enterprises, including Capricorn, participant in the Skoll Foundation, to pursue his vision of a sustainable world of peace and prosperity for all. Capricorn was created because Jeff believed that he could invest in ways that were both profitable and drove positive impact in the world.
Okay, I'm seeing my connection go in and out, so I'm just testing. Can you hear my voice still?
We hear you, Mindy.
Folks.
Mindy, you can't hear us, but we hear you. Mindy, you there? Nope. Well, we'll keep going and see whether we get Mindy back. Capricorn manages the Skoll Foundation's endowment, and they've enabled us to both meet the challenges of the past year with increased resources, and their success proves once again that sustainability and above market level returns are achievable. With that, I'd like to introduce Henry McLaughlin, who will be moderating this session. Henry, over to you.
Thank you, Don. Thank you for taking the time to join us and for introducing this conversation. I think I can speak on behalf of everyone at Capricorn when I say that we're so excited that we get to work alongside you and Jeff and Larry Brilliant and everyone at the Skoll Foundation, especially thinking of the incredible work you've done over the past year in the response to the pandemic. Over a year ago, when everyone was focused on what will happen to New York or Paris or London, you were focused on what is going to happen in the rest of the world and how do we make sure that places that do not have strong healthcare systems have an adequate response. And you've put hundreds of millions of dollars to work in that response, and frankly saved countless lives. And it's unknowable how many lives have been saved, but it's incredibly. I think we can be incredibly grateful that we get to work alongside you and everyone at the Skoll Foundation and supporting that work. So, and I think the world has been in a pretty dark place over the past year, but we're certainly in a slightly better place than we would have been if it weren't for the work that you're doing and many other organizations.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. I'll leave the screen, but thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Don. So I'd love to, first of all, welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining this conversation today on impact investing and how we can scale and not be a niche, but really become the mainstream of how capital is invested and deployed globally. And I think we're very lucky today to be joined by several people who either as investors or activists have demonstrated how to scale impact investing and achieve very significant impacts in the real world while also generating returns for their investors or for the constituents they represent. And before I give everyone a chance to introduce themselves, I wanted to put things in the context of the past year. And, like we should all be in Oxford, right? And we're doing this way for all the reasons we well know. But I think on the silver lining of this, of course, we have to travel. We didn't have to drive cars. And I think that ties well to what happened in 2020, where we saw greenhouse reduced significantly globally. And so it turns out that if we really, really want to, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, we kind of knew that it was possible in theory, but now we have the proof that if we want to, we can reduce emissions. And I think a lot of us want to. So maybe I could give you two numbers to put that into perspective. The first one is $1 trillion, and that's the amount of capital that's been, or value rather, that's been created over 2020 in renewable energy, in batteries, and broadly on the creation of green businesses and technologies that enable us to transition to a low emission world. To put that in perspective, $1 trillion in constant dollars is similar to the value creation wave in the internet in 1999. So this is truly an astounding amount of value creation over a 12-month period, and one that compares actually to the birth or the early years of the internet. And then another number, in contrast, is minus $700 billion. And that's how much money the shareholders of the oil and gas industry have lost over the past year because of their shareholding in an industry that was near collapse, and it's certainly in fast decline. And so, I don't know how much horse carriage owners lost in the 19th century when trains got built. I suspect the math, we would find that it's not far off the amount of money and capital that was destroyed in oil and gas the past year. 2020 was also an important year and a crucial year for racial equity and social justice. And it's certainly not a year that we discovered this issue, but it's hopefully the year that we realized that it had to be addressed with great urgency. I thought of a few things I wanted to say about this, and then of course after what happened 2 days ago, I think the only thing to say is to add a name to the list. So the name is Dante Wright, who's the latest Black American to be killed by the police. And of course, that name joins a long list of others that we know, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, and Eric Garner, and many others over the years. And I think the reason why I mentioned this also is I was recently reading about something called the common knowledge theory, which is this idea that things change not so much because we are provided with a new piece of information, but because we come to the realization that everyone else has also been given that information. And I think 2020 illustrates this common knowledge theory quite well. None of the issues that occurred in 2020 were new, from climate to racial equity to access to healthcare and inequality in our societies. We all knew all of those issues and we knew about them. I think what's different is we now know that everyone else knows, that everyone else realizes the importance of these issues. And so hopefully that can help us drive change faster, this realization that everyone else also, or most of other people, understand it. So I'll maybe stop pontificating about 2020. I'm sure there'll be plenty of books written about 2020 and what I can say in a few minutes. But it does lead me to think about something that came up in our prep call, where Damien mentioned that maybe this was our 1968, or maybe we're living our 1968 moment, where there's this generational moment where everything seems possible on so many issues. And so now the burden is on us to figure out how we make the most of it, and how we try to actually address those issues fundamentally. So maybe without further introduction, I'll pass it on to Damien to start. Damien, you're an investor, an entrepreneur, I would also add an activist, role model, a leader to many, and doing fascinating things to address social and racial inequities in the U.S. And I'd love to hear about your journey that took you there and what you're trying to do at Lafayette Square.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'm so excited to be here. We are, as you point out, at an inflection point as a society. It's a global conversation, but America seems to find itself repeatedly in the crosshairs. My name is Damian Dwin. I'm founder and CEO of Lafayette Square. Our goals at Lafayette Square are to house 100,000 people in affordable housing by 2030, employ 100,000 people in small business by 2030, and provide advice to 1,000 women and people of color interested in creating new investment management firms. Our theory of change at Lafayette is that services and capital, when delivered together, can make impact, specifically in housing, jobs, and inclusion. My personal journey is tied to this theory of change insofar as we are all suffering from a multi-trillion-dollar shortage of affordable housing, trillion-dollar shortage of credit to small, medium-sized business, and of course, a $75 trillion investment management business where women and people of color manage 1.5% of the money combined. We believe that is bad public policy. And being the son of a bus driver, born and raised in Washington, D.C., I've had the fortune of building and exiting several investment management businesses. And I have a real sense of awe at what can be effectuated in a capitalist society, but also a lot of survivor's guilt and sadness that we don't have more people of color who are achieving success in alternatives, but specifically using alternatives as a means to impact society for good. I think a lot about what it is to make single-digit returns in things that are good for society. I think a lot about credit in the ESG and impact investing arena and see tremendous opportunity in affordable housing and small business lending, where we are investing a lot of resources with help from Capricorn, Morgan Stanley, and our other stakeholders at Lafayette Square. We're a 50-person organization that was conceived, interestingly, almost a year ago to the day. It was April 18th, 2020, when I reached out to Darren Walker at Ford Foundation and senior leadership at Morgan Stanley with the idea for Lafayette Square. So we are hard at work. We are very optimistic about what can happen, but we do believe the business plan for Lafayette Square, in effect, was written in 1968, following a summer in 1967 that felt a lot like the summer of 2020. Violence, destruction, sadness, loss of life, and a lot of reflection about racism and inequality. So glad to be here and honored to be a panelist.
Thank you, Damon. Maybe I'll give a chance Anna to introduce yourself. Anna, I think of you as the net zero. I know you told me not to do that joke, but I think there are enough climate nerds on the call that will get it. You're the co-founder of Respira, and you're figuring out ways to channel billions of dollars to tropical forests around the world that are under threats of destruction. In the process, you're also trying to help corporations, investment firms, governments to find responsible ways for reducing their emissions and contributing to the protection of natural ecosystems around the world in the process. So you're going to help us close the distance to zero. I've been told I had to use close the distance once, so I've done it twice. And I'd love to tell about your journey and what got you to Respira and how you're going to save all these forests.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And it's a real privilege to participate in this forum. So I'm really be here. Yes, as Henry said, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Respira International. This is a business that we set up 18 months ago to solve the problem of how we can raise finance and capital into forests, but also other nature-based solutions to help deal with the problem of climate change. My business partner and myself, we come from a background in financial markets, and we have always taken an innovative approach to trying to find solutions to how to make capital more accessible. And we were looking at, what we could do to encourage the development of voluntary carbon markets and what was necessary. And we, obviously realized that a lot of these projects need funding and finance, but we don't have experience in project development, but we do have experience in financial solutions. And what we realized is that a lot of these projects really needed offtake agreement in the same way that you would do in power markets. So we thought if we can offer the equivalent of a long-term offtake agreement to these projects, then essentially these projects would have financial stability and visibility on revenues with which to then expand and develop the businesses and the projects. Effectively, they had a bankable security. So that's what we sought to do with Respira. We wanted to find ways in which to channel institutional capital into projects, but at the same time, generate a return for investors. So, to make that transition from thinking about, impact investments, which were normally the domain of NGOs, and you're making the investment for impact, but not necessarily for return. So to bridge that gap of having an impact and generating a return. So we underwrite the commodities that are being produced by these projects, so basically the carbon credits, by giving a floor price. Now, voluntary carbon markets are in the process of development, and what I think we all accept is that we need to put a real price on carbon, but we don't know what the future carbon is going to be at this stage. We're hoping it's going to increase significantly from here because it has to, in order to have an impact and an effect on decarbonization. So we want the projects that we're working with to benefit in that price appreciation. So we underwrite a price, but then we have revenue sharing agreements with them on the upside. We then are packaging up those credits into diversified portfolio of high quality verified offsets, which we then corporates and other institutions who are looking to use offsets to meet their net zero commitments. That's sort of what we do in a nutshell.
Thank you, Anna. So now I'd like to turn to Mindy. You need CEO series. You're a Skoll awardee yourself, so of course we normally would be with you in Oxford, as we have been many years. Think of you as the person whose job it is to, well, first of all, listen. And listen, you have to listen to CEOs of companies telling you what to recognize, and listen to CEOs of investment firms who tell you it's, they don't know how to do it or don't know how to get to net zero. You have to listen to the politicians. And then in the end, after a lot of listening, you politely but firmly tell people what it is they should be doing and what they need to do for climate and the environment. And I think people ignore you at their own peril. I'm sure there are a lot of CEOs in the months after the 2016 election in the US who wish they had listened more carefully to what you had to say on this too shall pass. This is a moment that will pass, and we have to continue to focus on the Paris Agreement, on decarbonization, and on meeting the climate goals. And so, yeah, I'd love for you to maybe introduce yourself and tell us about what Sirius is focused on right now. And maybe on another note, do you ever get a bit angry after listening to everyone coming up with excuses, and when you have to tell them what it is they need to do for climate?
Henry, thank you, and that was a good note of introduction. as well. I thought I would take out the headphones. Thank you. I do feel part of the Skoll family, so it's very nice to be here, and it's tragic that we can't be together, and I hope everybody is safe and healthy. We're all here together, our group on this panel, doing very different things, but all mindful of the fact that we have got to move capital and everybody into understanding the impacts of climate change, of COVID, of poverty, of justice, that they are all tied together. If there's anything COVID taught us, it taught us that we're an interrelated world, and that when catastrophe hits, it's a human catastrophe, it's an economic catastrophe, and it's one that we ought to avoid at all costs. At Ceres, we make the case that not only ought a company or an investment firm act on things like climate change and the impacts around the world to what it means to the very future of our planet and our kids, that if they don't want to do it because it's right, or because we're all collectively worried about our children, and despite the fact that some people want to put an R on it or a D on it, or Republican or Democrat, these are issues of the future of our world. And justice is part of it, and equity. Climate impacts everybody. And it doesn't work if we just have socially responsible investors, some small cohort, worrying about where to put their investments, whether it's in good guy stuff or non-good guy stuff. What we want to make the case is that investing in sustainable companies, and sustainable means whether or not they're sustainable by the way they treat their employees and their neighbors and people in their neighborhoods, as well as the climate, and that they ought to do what's right, not only because we care about it, but because it impacts their bottom line. So at Ceres, we are trying to integrate sustainability into capital markets. We work with about 120 of the largest companies to get them to set audacious goals around sustainability, again, broadly defined. It's not E issues only, environmental and social issues as well. And trying to make sure those goals that they set are public, they're transparent, they're accountable, and there are short, medium, and long-term goals embedded in what they say they're going to do. And it's always a trust but verify. You can't just say, oh, great, they put it on paper, we're all good. The same thing with investors. We work with $55 trillion worth of investors. I can't even tell you how many zeros that is, but 540 global investors who have joined us and said, we're going to engage with the 100 largest emitters of carbon emissions, and we're going to change their practices because we are their owners, and we've got a say in what they do. So what we're trying to do at Ceres is integrate that sense of sustainability is not only about bleeding hearts, as they used to like to attribute to me in the first 30 years of my career as a regulator, a lawyer, and so on. But it's in their interest from a financial perspective. And if that's what it takes to move them, well, fine, that's the arguments we'll make, because they're real, they're clear, they're material, they're impactful. And so with companies, we do everything from work with their boards of directors all the way through how they move their supply chains. With investors, we work with where they put their investments and how do they analyze risk. With policymakers, we bring the voice of capital market leaders so nobody could diminish us as only environmentalists, which of course I'm quite proud of. But if they want a CEO of an investment firm, we'll bring a CEO of an investment firm. But we need to make the case that we need policy, because we can't solve the problem of climate as but one issue, and there are many, although climate impacts everything we all care about. But if they need to hear from business leaders and investors, in fact, they will. Today we had 300 CEOs of the largest companies join us in an article that was put out in the New York Times, but across the globe, saying we need strong policy measures to address climate change. And finally, we work with federal financial regulators that we have to integrate the impacts, the economic impacts of climate change at the Federal Reserve, because it's a financial material risk, and at the Securities and Exchange Commission. And Janet Yellen has just informed us, the Secretary of the Treasury, that she's going to address climate risk in how she does her work. And I think on all the things we're talking about, whether it's poverty or equity or whether it's COVID, these things are interrelated. Our economy cannot keep growing or equitably thriving if we don't address all of them. And that's what we try and do with Ceres. And I'd say one final word. I'm hopeful on the climate side, at least, that the private sector is getting it, does understand it, is starting to move. And I underline starting and highlight it with yellow, and it's a fight every day and pushing company by company. But today we stood with Apple when they said, for the first time, a Fortune 100 company said, we need to mandate the disclosure of climate risk at the SEC, something that actually Jeff Skoll was responsible for helping us pass in 2010, but it hasn't been effective. But now we've got companies and investors calling for it. So at least there are opportunities in front of us with this new administration.
Actually, in the discussion, the Earth Day Summit is coming up, and as you pointed out, you've just led the charge with hundreds of people from the business and investors to get the U.S. to be very ambitious in its updated pledge of carbon emissions ahead of COP26. So the next 10 days are and for policy, not just in the U.S., but really globally. So I hope we'll have good news in 10 days. I wanted to Rob. So Rob, you're the CEO and founder of Aristata. I like to think of you as the person that we need to call when people do not listen to NIMBY. So your job is to sue corporations and governments who think they can get away with destroying the climate, polluting the environment, underpaying their employees. And I'll probably stop the list there because it's depressing. But whatever wrongdoing people are up to, you and your team are there to challenge them. And incredibly, you found a way to do this while also generating attractive returns for investors. It's called impact litigation funding. And it's honestly one of the most exciting things I've come across in my career. And so I'd love for you to introduce yourself, tell us about your journey, and frankly tell us about how you're going to do this amazing work in litigation funding.
Henry, thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction. Thanks also to the Skoll Group and to Capricorn for giving me and Aristata the opportunity here. Yeah, very, very happy to give a bit about the journey and about what we're trying to do. Aristata, as Henry has said, is the first impact-focused litigation fund. We're effectively a private equity fund that invests in commercial litigation to drive tangible and measurable impact and change company behavior, ultimately, in the long run. My background, I spent the bulk of my career working in traditional public interest environmental law at a group here in London called Client Earth. Public litigation and law has been used for impact very effectively for decades, funded mostly by philanthropy. I went in-house here in the United Kingdom for a bit at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and we were looking, the question on the whiteboard was, how can we innovate? How can we look at innovative uses of litigation for driving impact? And the first thing we said is, what is this great sort of infrastructure and these great public interest groups doing around company behavior? How are commercial actors being brought to task? And the short answer was they really weren't. There wasn't much by way of volume. There wasn't much by way of size of public interest litigators dealing with companies directly. And in digging further into that, and this is sort of where the genesis of Aristata came from, or the need, is recognizing the sheer cost and the role of resources in determining case outcomes in the commercial litigation space. Boiling it down, ultimately, if you are a party to a piece of litigation and you have significant resources, you can generally use those resources to get a better outcome, right? So party A spills $100 million worth of oil on party B. If party A knows that party B doesn't have significant cash reserves, they're likely to say, we'll give you 10 today. Otherwise, we'll keep you in court for a decade and you'll need to spend at least that much to get a favorable outcome. So for too many claimants in the commercial litigation system, the question isn't, will justice be served? It's, can I afford justice? Right? And that's a fundamental and systemic problem that seriously tips the scales towards those corporates mostly that have the resources to play the game. So commercial litigation funding represents a solution. We worked closely with the Bridgespan Group out of Boston to screen all of our deals for impact upfront. We look at the case itself. Importantly, we look at scalability and replicability. How can we set a precedent where a win, in one case in one jurisdiction can be rolled out successfully again? And ultimately, we want to be able to send a strong commercial signal that the true cost of this damage, the true cost of these externalities should be paid, right? And corporates are happy to talk about accountability and responsibility, but unless you're willing to actually step up and pay the damage that you have caused in the world, then we're always going to have a serious problem, and it's generally those that are vulnerable and disadvantaged that pay that price. So we are looking at a wide range of potential sort of impact areas around the world. We have cases in our pipeline looking at, as you say, Henry, gender pay equality, looking at human rights cases, environmental damage, industrial relations cases. So we're looking to try to break into the commercial litigation system in a way that mirrors the success many have had in public interest environmental litigation and social impact litigation against governments for years.
Thank you, Rob. I think that's new. It'll certainly be new to a lot of people in the session because I think it's a perfectly new way of putting capital to work. So hopefully people will look into it in more detail. I wanted to turn maybe just to the four of you and ask about this moment we're in, because we've just gone through a very traumatic, very difficult year. At the same time, we're seeing so much momentum and so much optimism for things that seemed difficult to address and that we now have an opportunity to address. And I think, Damon, starting with you, I mean, you mentioned during our prep call, like, is this our 1968? And by the way, I'm not sure you meant, but how do you think of this moment that we're in, right? And what's possible and how we make sure that when we look back, we don't feel like we missed an opportunity for real transformation?
Well, look, first of all, I'm optimistic. I think good things are ahead. I'm also sanguine about the missed opportunity from the 80s and 90s to do more. We know in 1968, Kerner Commission published a seminal report on housing, jobs, less racism, recognizing the importance of community development. We saw in 1977 the introduction of the Community Reinvestment Act in response to redlining in America, where Black people primarily were denied access to mortgage financing for their homes. CRA changed the behavior of banks, but not in the ways that people anticipated. And so here we are in 2021 with a global perspective on impact and ESG, yet these burning questions about how to use capitalism in a more productive way. We have better access to information, and we are all in touch with facts in ways that we've never had before. However, 10 years ago, there was basic disagreement about climate when even then the evidence was overwhelming. It takes time. So how do we build big coalitions of liberals and conservatives, international coalitions to advance this work? And what is the work? For us at Lafayette Square, the work is about place-based capitalism. I think in the end, we have to find a way to empower communities to raise capital, to invest in the community, solving their own problems. I don't think we're going to get national legislation that receives the uptake with the intended consequences, or intended outcomes. I think we really have to find a way to partner with local stakeholders at the table to make a difference in the community, whether it's in affordable housing or small business lending or renewable energy, specifically solar here in the States. I think this is different than what we've seen in the past because interest rates are at zero. We're in a recession digging our way out. And we have the opportunity for a global coalition that recognizes the list of priorities and then delegates to communities to find a way forward. So I'm optimistic, but I 100% believe we have to have new players step into the arena with agency, taking possession of their power and using capitalist tools to try to drive new outcomes.
Damon. I think, certainly, the same people doing the same things will not reach different outcomes, right? So you need to start with new teams, new people, and new strategies if you want to actually achieve different outcomes in the real world. Maybe I'd ask a similar version of this question from the rest of you, Anna, Rob, Min. What do you think is possible today that wasn't possible 5 or 10 years ago? Like, what has shifted for you over the past few months where you're suddenly seeing that were not before?
So what has turned the light on in climate change? And that is a good question. I mean, first of all, let's all take as a given, stipulate to the facts, as Bob may say, or Rob may say in the case, that the 4 years with a certain president of the United States was not helpful. So that I would argue, whether it's housing or justice or equity, poverty, climate change, those were not our time. We now have an administration that believes that the fundamental issues that we're talking about are not only bad for humanity, they're bad for democracy, and they're bad for our economy. So leadership makes a difference, and the political leadership has changed, at least in the United States, various places around the world. I think as it relates to climate change, we are seeing the devastating impacts, be it Puerto Rico, be it forest fires in California, be it storms and floods everywhere, where people are finally acknowledging this is real and it could impact me tomorrow, and that the impacts could be quite egregious. Investors are starting to see, you opened up, Henry, saying, there are many investors invested in the oil industry. They didn't do so well over the last number of years. They did poorly. That's a technology, so to speak, or a resource of the future. What we're seeing is that auto companies are saying by 2030 to 2035, we won't see another combustion engine vehicle coming off the assembly line. We will see electric vehicles. The money to be made is in the future technology. Look at Elon Musk, and I know Capricorn has been supportive of Elon Musk and Tesla. They're worth double, triple what GM and Ford are worth together. The numbers are telling us that investing in the future makes a lot of sense. Now, is enough of it happening? No. Are we seeing enough dollars going into the developing world to build a new energy system? No, but we have some data points to start the discussion, and investors and companies are recognizing it. Companies are now seeing that people don't want to work for them if they're not a company who has a bigger vision than profits over the short term, that their consumers care and that their investors care. So there are enough powerful forces on the capital markets for us to start to see a change. We're seeing it where we need. No, we got to push mightily on all fronts, on litigation, on education, on lobbying, on changing laws. But we at least have the attention of the biggest capital market players that they've got to address climate change, as an example. And if they don't, they will end up having to do it because regulators are saying that. We've never had an administration where the Secretary of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve Board and the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission and all sorts of buzzwords and acronyms and agencies with lots of initials are now saying climate risk is a financial risk that needs to be regulated. So a lot has changed, and capital markets are imperfect, but we need the resources of capital markets if we're going to rebuild a clean energy economy rather than a dirty energy economy. And we need the billions of dollars, if not trillions, that are being spent around the world for building back better out of COVID to go into housing, to go into communities, and go into building infrastructure that's clean, that's about good jobs, and that's about taking us to a better future and good for the economy at the same time. The bottom line is, I think we've gotten away from it's either or, because that's a bunch of garbage. It is not either or, and I think we've all shown that. It is not, if you do something good for the world, the economy is going to suffer. That is just an inaccurate and position that needs to be phased out of people's minds.
Thank you, Mindy. I was reading between the lines of what you said, and I think maybe we could go to Rob, because it's the second time we mentioned oil and gas companies. So any plans to sue some oil and gas companies? It sounds like they had it coming.
Well, I mean, again, it's not what we're looking to do isn't punitive, Henry, necessarily, but they do present a bit of a target-rich environment, I would say, when it comes to leveraging the system. No, I mean, I think just reflecting on what Mindy was saying, I mean, around in your fundamental question a few minutes ago, Henry, of what could we do today versus where we were 5 or 10 years ago. On the investor side, it has been, I don't think, of innovative strategy like Aristoteles would have gotten the time of day 5 years ago, let alone 10, right? I think it has been very exciting for a number of reasons to see investor interest in new strategies in areas that are solving problems that are moving things forward, that aren't just are looking in well-trodden paths, right? And I think that the momentum, as I've been out fundraising and speaking with others that are trying to get interesting and novel strategies off the ground, has been, there's still a lot of work to do, but the messaging is there, the promise of the capital is there, coming from big institutions in particular, although we're still waiting to find a way to access all of it cleanly when it comes down from the BlackRocks of the world and others. But I think there is, as Damien was echoing, there is a sense of hope. I think there is an opportunity there if we can continue to capture this momentum on the investor side and continue to put good products in the market that are, as Mindy said, making good economic returns and doing something tangibly good for the world, whatever cause it is that we're looking at.
Yes, if I can come in and following on from what Mindy was saying, I think what's different now is that with regard to climate change, 5 to 10 years ago, yes, we had the debate, is there climate change, isn't there climate change? But there was a lot of indifference as well. So people were either climate believers or climate deniers combined with indifference meant that we didn't really do much, or we didn't pay attention. But about 2 years ago, with Greta, with Extinction Rebellion, I think there was a real change, because then you sort of had a bottom-up groundswell of support towards climate change, at least in Europe. And this started to apply real pressure on the private sector, on corporates, that they needed to do something about climate, that there was a real, social license to operate requirement now and to take action. And that, I think, combined with, the top-down measures and forces that Mindy was referring to, sort of really led to, I think, a perfect storm. And where we are now is that, we can actually have conversations with the private sector about climate. They are, taking action. They are taking notice. We've got some notable leaders in that, Microsoft, etc. But it is taking a hold, and so we have corporates in the private sector taking voluntary, action. They're not being forced to in many cases, and I think that's really positive. And I do see that as a positive change.
Thank you, Anna. You're making an interesting point, because I think in the impact community, and especially in the impact investment community, we're often faced with this issue where our opponents, our adversaries, or whoever represents the current status quo, tends to deny us the possibility of change unless we can prove that we can fix everything, right? So essentially, unless you can prove that you can fix all of climate, or you can fix a whole social issue, then you don't get the acknowledgement that you're actually legitimate in trying to fix some of it, right? And I think that's a difficult thing to navigate. Important to not get lost. Like, it's okay to start fixing part of a problem, and then most of it, and eventually all of it. And I think the fact that you can't show from the beginning exactly where it's going to end shouldn't be held against trying new things and trying to accomplish important things. So maybe that leads me to which I'll leave open to the four of you to answer as you wish, which is, in your personal journeys, not everyone transitions to. You were all, three of you were traditional investors, and Mindy, you've done a number of things in government and activism. But there's necessarily this moment where you realize that you're going to have a different career, right? Where you're to be focused on making a difference, achieving impact, and that's a very different trajectory from more linear careers in finance or government. So I was wondering, is there a road to Damascus? Is there an epiphany moment where you realize, okay, now I want to put my skills to work to address this issue, or I couldn't live with myself if I didn't focus on this in my day job. Is there a moment you realize you want to focus on impact issues?
I'm happy to begin. Look, as a Black man in leveraged finance, growing up at Goldman Sachs and Credit Suisse, and then even having my own firm for over 10 years, managing a lot of money for institutions, I did feel misaligned between my day job and the personal passions that drove me. It's a blessing to live a life where you don't have to be misaligned, where your work can be totally in sync with your beliefs. Artists have that luxury. People in the investment business, people in the law. We're not like doctors. This is a different vocation we've chosen, but it's one of the glories of impact investing and this new paradigm of organizing capitalist tools to make the world a better place. It feels healthier, cleaner, and fundamentally more aligned. And I think that is heartwarming and encouraging. And I believe we are just scratching the surface of the potential for using innovation and the tools that we were all taught at these large financial institutions in ways that will help move our world to a better place. It is conspicuous that we're able to do so while rates are at zero. And we've seen this broad convergence of investment returns across asset classes, essentially down to single-digit returns. We have agency. We can build back and do it better and do it with integrity, aligning who we are as human beings with how we spend our time during the day. So I'm encouraged by that. But it took some time to get here, and there was a lot of loss of talent and destruction prior to this moment.
When I was in graduate school in business in a joint JD MBA programming, so getting my law degree and business degree, when I finished, I accepted a job with a public interest research group for $7,000 when everybody in my class was whatever. There was some minimum below which you just didn't go because that's what you had to prove in business and law and so on. I spent a good year or two having my parents, who I was very close to, introducing me to people as, this is my daughter, she's a lawyer. She could have had a real job. Pretty insulting, but it felt right then and it feels right now. And not everybody has to get there coming out of graduate school. I went into politics and out of politics. But what you do have to know is that you spend a lot of time at work, whether it's 40 years of your life or 50 and sometimes 60 hours a week, certainly for many of us. And if you don't like what you're doing and you don't believe in what you're doing, it's a big waste of time, even if you're making money. And not everybody has the choice, but if you have the choice, it is such a privilege to be able to find money to live. No, I don't have the resources that I might have if I was a senior partner at a big firm, or if I stayed with the environmental investment firm that I founded in 1990. But I've never looked back or thought twice. I have resources, having been in the nonprofit world almost all of my life, to live fine, and the privilege of working hard and leaning in on things that matter is just a privilege. If you have the opportunity, as I tell many young people, take it. It's just, there is no question that dragging yourself to work every day is not a good thing. And in this world, there are opportunities everywhere. I mean, they may not be as good as the 3 or 4 of us might feel, but there are good opportunities.
Yeah, I think, I mean, simply the parallels, I spent most of my career working in nonprofits and NGOs, right? I mean, what we were doing day in, day out, and that was what was satisfying was identifying problems and trying to come up with some interesting solutions. The challenge was, where Aristotle came from, was we ran into a problem that needed serious capital to help drive that solution, right? This wasn't something that you were going to be able to do via philanthropy. The scale was all wrong. So, Henry, your sort of road to Damascus moment, at least on my journey, I'd always been driven by this sort of sense of injustice, that the big and the wealthy were able to get away with a lot at the expense of the many and the poor. And all of a sudden coming into this space and saying, okay, I think we're doing something good here in this public interest litigation world, and recognizing, my God, commercial actors that are contributing intentionally or not to a lot of the problems we're all trying to solve are completely out of bounds. That to me was this sort of major moment of, okay, we have to come up with some kind of solution to apply this methodology in a new and interesting way, right? So yeah, I think that's capital as a solution, right, in a system that otherwise isn't going to work without it.
So what led me to do what I'm doing now? About 4 years ago, I started to work with this company called Green Gold Peru, and it was a sustainable logging business in the Amazon in Peru. So FSC certified logging, sustainable sector, really to combat the illegal logging. And we were looking to refinance and restructure the business, and going around institutional investors and say, okay, well, we're trying to raise capital. And suddenly it sort of just seemed very strange to say, well, I'm raising money to cut down trees, whilst at the same time, we've got this climate issue, and we are, trying to sort of investigate ways of decarbonizing and investing in carbon capture technologies, when actually on our doorstep we have the most amazing carbon capture technology available in the world to us, which are forests, and we are cutting them down, and we shouldn't be cutting them down because they are the most effective, most cost-effective way of removing carbon from the atmosphere. So suddenly we had this sort of realization that actually we shouldn't be raising money for this sustainable logging business. We should turn it into a carbon sequestration business. And it was, that was the inspiration for setting up Respira, because we thought, as I said in my introduction, okay, what do projects need? They need a market for the commodity or the service that they're producing, these ecosystem services, and we need to commercialize it and turn it into a revenue stream for, the societies who normally would have been living off the forest, illegal logging. 90% of logging in the Amazon is illegal logging. So how do we provide revenues and economic means for development for the communities that are living in those forests? And so that was my sort of path to where we've got to now.
I'd like to take the conversation in another direction now. And I read this report a few weeks ago. I think he put it out that banks, since the Paris Agreement, have financed almost $4 trillion of fossil fuels. And I haven't gone back in my back to spend hundreds of hours since the Paris Agreement speaking to bankers, and I'm sure many of you have been in a similar position. I know, Mindy, you were in a similar position. And there have been press releases about ending the finance of coal and aligning to net zero and all these great things. And then the number comes out, and if anything, the scale of financing of fossil fuels from banks has accelerated since the Paris Agreement. So I guess my question to all of you, and then maybe starting with Mindy, since it's really something you focus on, is how do you fix the problem in spite of, or alongside, or sometimes in partnership with the organizations and the people who've created the problem in the first place? Which is not ideal. Like, you want to fix a problem, you don't always want to work with the person who's actually creating the problem. And then also, organizations are still benefiting from the problem today and perpetuating it. So how do you address that, even intellectually?
Yeah. Well, the problem in large part is because of the tyranny of short-termism. So even if banks know, and I will hit your question head on, even if banks know that investing in coal is a losing proposition, investing in oil and gas, you just have to look at the oil companies and their share price over the last year or two is a losing proposition. There are still many of those investments over a very short-term period just by making the investment, meaning the banker at Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan that banks fossil fuels wants the transactions. He makes or she make all their money on, I did a deal, and 3 months from now the bank won't even own the paper that they just lent. They'll have sold it into the market. They have no incentive. They have no incentive not to keep doing that, which is terrible because the markets are designed around short-term fees and short-term practices. So we've got to start changing those practices, which, believe me, if Wall Street hasn't changed in 100 years, and Damien lived it and Rob and others, we know it's not easy to do. So I'm not going to say, whoops, but there are a number of things we can do. One is this is the first time the Federal Reserve Bank that has a prudential responsibility to regulate banks that is saying carbon is a financial risk to our economic system, and we have to start looking at it. They're the regulator. So one is there needs to be more regulation, be it at a state banking commissioner level or at a Federal Reserve Bank level. Investors who invest in those banks, if they believe the banks are going in the wrong direction, they need to not be invested in those banks. Consumers who bank at those banks need to change where they bank. And there's enough of that starting to happen. But perhaps most importantly, banks are seeing that their portfolios, which are bigger than just who they're financing, are they investing in oil and gas or airplanes or jet fuel that's highly carbon not efficient, that what they need to see is the risk to the bank overall from every sector they're banking in is growing more and more risky. That it's not only their direct investment, it's investing in the insurance sector that may take a huge hit. It's investing in huge amounts of the sectors. And we're seeing some of those risks being the reason that some capital is being pulled out of highly fossil fuel projects. Definitely not enough. And I think whenever you're going to change something, doing it bank by bank or company by company, one by one, is just simply too slow. You need to change the rules of the game so there's a level playing field and everybody's involved in playing by the same rules, not just 4 progressive banks are doing something good and 40 not so good. We simply don't have time for that. The climate challenge is not only massive, but we need to make changes at a scale and at a pace that's unprecedented to anything we all know if we want to give our kids a shot.
Damien, do you have thoughts on that? On how do you solve the problem in spite of those, or sometimes alongside those who've created it?
Look, I think a subtext of Mindy's remarks is that this is a moment to be ambitious. I wholeheartedly agree. If we go small, shame on us. This is achievable, but we have to simultaneously create a big tent that can accommodate strange bedfellows, new combinations that we haven't seen historically. And I think we got to ask for a lot in the same breath. I like the idea of emphasizing place, community, and showing how the community benefits from new jobs. This has to be a conversation about impacting human beings where they live, where they feel a stake in the work and actually can have a hand in seeing it through. Clearly, we're going to have a loss of manufacturing jobs. Clearly, we're going to watch the commercial real estate business and other industries go through fundamental changes. But there also are suddenly created unique opportunities where we can include entire groups of people that we didn't think would benefit. I'll give you a basic example. In this pandemic in the United States, the economy in Utah grew. Utah actually expanded during a pandemic. How does that happen? How do we think about mobility and inclusion? And how do we take it from just a conversation about the coast to something that is national? We have to have a plan for every single community in the United States. And I think that type of thinking is going to take place in Europe as well. We can do it, but there have to be clear intentions up front that we want to create a situation where everybody has a seat at the table and no one's being left behind.
Hey, Rob, I see you unmuted yourself. I actually wanted to ask you a bit specific that's in a similar theme to what we just discussed. And I know you're involved in a litigation to protect the indigenous community in the Pacific. So you can't necessarily share a lot about this. But I was wondering, like, when you think of that specific litigation you're involved in and the possibility for litigation to address historical wrongs, like, do you see any hope of using that template that you're using for the Pacific community, for people of color in other parts of the world and even in the US maybe?
Yeah, Henry, thanks. And I think I can blend my answer to that with my follow-up to Mindy and Damien's comments of a moment ago, because I think the short answer is yes, absolutely, that the entire template is replicability. That being the slight stick to Mindy's carrot, I think that we need change to happen fast. There has to be, you cannot allow in any sector, there are going to be lowest common denominator actors. It is easy right now not to change. It's easy right now in many instances not to do the right thing and not to move forward, right? So more regulation can certainly move that dial. In some ways, our approach becomes a bit of an enforcement mechanism, right? To try to prevent those bad actors from being able to act with impunity, because you want to empower the good actors. The four banks that might want to behave very well are going to be less inclined to do so if their four other competitors are making more money by behaving poorly, right? ultimately you've got to find a way to level that playing field. The case you referenced, Henry, is a fairly clean example of a bad actor dealing with simply leveraging that resource advantage that they have, right? You have these systemic problems. We're supporting an indigenous island community. It's a fairly straightforward piece of commercial litigation. There is a service provider with a contract, and part of that contract is that there are fees that are meant to be paid to this community that should be going to the building of hospitals and the provision of healthcare and a number of other important and impactful areas. But simply because this service provider has resources and this indigenous island community doesn't, years have gone by without the provision of these fees, right? So we see a wide range of these. The template is there, and unfortunately, the template is one of those of, again, looking of a resource advantage. People who are communities that are vulnerable, communities who are at less of an advantage, are going to continue to suffer until somebody forces them to behave in a different way, right? So I think, I am hopeful, and we need to go big and we need to focus at scale. I could not agree more. And we need to do something today. We need to find ways to take action today to improve people's behavior, because the longer we wait, then there are 5, 10, 200 more people or communities that have been affected in a negative way.
Thanks, Rob. And I want to turn to Anna. Anna, for you, like, I find your position really interesting because you're trying to channel very significant amount of capital, essentially, from the revenues and the balance sheets of large corporations globally into some of the poorest parts of the world to protect forests. You're trying to fits the structure of the capital markets and of the investment world, and not in a philanthropic manner. And you're hoping that by doing that, you're going to reach much greater scale and protect more of the natural ecosystem. But you get a ton of pushback. You get pushback from some parts of the environmental community that don't necessarily understand exactly what you're trying to achieve. You certainly get a ton of pushback from people who don't think that carbon should be taxed and see what you're doing as a sort of soft version of taxing carbon by saying you need to pay for offsets. But I like to think when you get a lot of pushback, it means you're doing something right because you're bothering people and sort of challenging the status quo. So if you think of like a specific project, I don't know if you could share with like a specific project you're working right now to preserve it. And what that looks like, right, in on the ground or on the specifics of channeling capital to do that.
Well, thank you. You've opened up the door for my great big frustration. So, we accept that we need to do something about climate change, and the most effective and the biggest bang for your buck right now in terms of doing something now, today, about climate change is on our doorstep. We've got carbon sinks that exist, forests, they're nature-based solutions, and they're being deforested. McKinsey, I think, came out with a study recently saying that, by 2030, we need to stop 78% of deforestation if we're going to have any chance of meeting our climate targets. 78% or 75%. TNC has come out with studies saying that a third of all emissions can be taken up by 2030 by forests, by avoided deforestation. And so we all recognize, I hope we recognize, how important it is, but then, you're with the financial community or with regulators or NGOs or even the press, and there's such a negative perception about using offsets, and we have to create a carbon, we have to pay for carbon, we have to pay for these ecosystem services, but nobody wants to pay for it, and yet we want to do something about climate. So I think there's this, there is this big tension between it. Net zero means that you have to use removals, but you can't use avoided credits, and that's just, that to me is a complete nonsense, because what we have right now are, as I say, existing forests that are being deforested at a huge rate. So one project, for example, that we're supporting is in Tanzania. It's run by a group called Carbon Tanzania. It is protecting 275,000 hectares of forest by preventing 1.25 million trees from being cut down annually. Now, the fact that we have come in and we are essentially the off-taker to the entirety of this project means that it's creating revenues for the communities. It's substituted a loss of revenues during the pandemic that have been lost from tourism, and so this has huge environmental, social impacts as well. It helps education. It's working towards eliminating poverty. It creates employment. Other co-benefits from this include protecting 13 endangered species, and so we want all of this to happen, but we have to be willing to pay for it. Now, coming to Mindy's earlier point, we can't decarbonize our economy overnight. We can't go sort of from today to in 2 months' time not using any fossil fuels. We obviously have to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels over time, but it can't happen overnight. So in the meantime, we have very sort of very scalable solutions available to us in carbon credits. So that is what we can do today. We can support the development of the carbon credit markets. We can be willing to buy these offtakes, which then go to developing countries in the global south, and it's just a win-win for everybody. So I do wish that this negative publicity that sort of seems to permeate against the use of offsets would be tempered.
Thank you, Anna. I open it quickly, scrolling up to look at questions that were asked earlier. And I thought there was an interesting question about what social justice movements or social investment strategies could learn from things that have happened in climate and the environment, where we're seeing more and more consensus and more regulation towards reducing emissions. Frankly, I think the question would go both ways, right? Are there also things that environmental investing and the environmental movement could learn from the social movements? So I like this idea of trying to explore that. I don't know if one of you has any thoughts on that to kick it off.
So just look, 100 CEOs of some of the largest companies met this weekend and came out in opposition to the atrocity of the anti-democratic, racist laws being put into place in Georgia. Just despicable, backwards-looking policy that will be copied in many, many places. It cannot just be Democrats versus Republicans or progressives versus somebody else or activists like us. We have to work to make these issues, and I would argue we didn't do this, so this is not anything serious is done, but to be sure that these issues are seen in the light that they are, that this is not bad for Black people or brown people. This is bad for democracy and society and humanity and the economy. And we've got to show that, and we've got to support things like, I'll get the team wrong because I'm so bad with sports analogies, but the baseball association pulling out of Atlanta, or was it the golfing? Spare me. Excuse me. I get that. But we've got to show that there are economic implications. And we are at a moment in time, and I'm not Pollyannish. I've been at this for a long time, but I am heartened when I see 100 CEOs standing up and say, you know what? This is not only good enough, it's despicable. And we're not only going to make a statement, we're going to pull our dollars out of your state, and states feel it. So these issues are all interrelated. And they are bigger than just the activist community, and bigger than just people with D's after their name, and bigger than those of us on the East Coast and the West Coast. They are about humanity and democracy. And I think the private sector is going to be an important voice in it, and it's our job to help that voice be loud and clear if needed. In this instance, I would argue they responded in the right direction.
Maybe I'll turn to you actually just to follow up on that. When we spoke a couple of weeks ago, you told me people have come sleeping in America, or actually I think you said in America and the rest of the world. So how do you I think the other motto this year is shifting power, right? So how do you shift power to people of color in America and beyond?
I think power is taken, not given. So I don't believe the shift happens. I think it is forced. I think it's, not to be cynical, but in the end fruitless to have conversations about race with business people. I think it goes nowhere. I do believe, on the other hand, you can have very productive conversations about place, community. I think geography is a very powerful tie that binds and leaves room for everybody to participate. 100%, we are seeing workforce dictate terms to management in ways that we've never seen before. And that explicitly does include women and people of color telling their employers they will walk out if they don't feel supported and aligned. This is a cultural difference that was missing several generations ago. History teaches economic warfare, economic punishment changes behavior in capitalist systems more than guilt. And so I think it's a very powerful thing that we're seeing broad coalitions. You know, the protests last summer involved proudly more white people than black marching in the streets of Brooklyn and Minneapolis and so many other cities around the country and the world. Coalitions are being built that are not limited to race. This is a new paradigm. It's very exciting, but it has to be backed up with action. And one of my favorite sayings is, there are no reinforcements. Help is not on the way. We are the help. And so what does it mean to get beyond oneself and empathetically, constructively, thoughtfully patch together new networks that see this as a seminal moment where we can make a difference? But you have to have common cause, and you have to keep it as broad as humanly possible. I love seeing that that's happening with a demographic mix that looks nothing like what would have been predicted 2, 3, 4 years ago, prior to some of the activity that we've experienced over the last 12, 18 months in particular. So I think it's a harbinger of more to come. I think it's terrific, but capitalist tools are very much a part of the solution, and new coalitions are critical to how that comes together. And I think the power comes in place. It is intentional that Georgia was viewed as an ideal place to take a stand, not just because of what could be accomplished in Georgia, but also because of the message it sends to other smaller communities that would think about some of the poor choices being put forward by politicians in that one location. But once you get past the protesting, the folks in Atlanta will be the first to tell you they care about jobs. They want economic activity. They don't want to see folks leaving their state and taking money with them. They want that coming back. So this is where I think great checks and balances are playing out, and the system is actually working. I find it very encouraging.
Thank you, Damien. I agree with Ruth and the winning quote. Power is taken, not given. It makes me. It actually reminds me of another quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is, "Your actions speak so loudly, I can't hear what you say." And I think this is an issue that we face a lot. We were speaking earlier about banks. We mentioned the oil and gas industry. Generally, the organizations and the institutions that are on the other side of this conversation, I don't know if there's a negative equivalent of Skoll.org forum where they get together and figure out the negative side. Hopefully not. But we're clearly facing opponents that are well financed and that we're trying to push through. And we can't be naive about that. Maybe Anna, like you could tell us a little bit about the difference between actions and statements, because your organization, Respira, is meant to bridge the gap between the many net zero carbon emission statements that we're hearing in the press pretty much every day, and the reality of money and capital flowing towards protecting the forests or decarbonizing. And, all these really ambitious statements, and then you look at the numbers and it doesn't seem like that much is happening.
Yes, another quote that I had is, "Don't let perfect get in the way of good." And I think that, part of the problem with the net zero statements that are made by, 2030 or 2050, and this sort of emphasis on having removals, offsets, and not reductions, and this distinction between carbon neutral and net zero, I think, are really, really unhelpful, because they're essentially, allowing and other organizations who are making these statements, giving them the excuse to do nothing in the interim, because if the removal technologies aren't there and they're not scalable and they're not developed and they're far too expensive at the moment, and yet we've got technologies that are available to us now in nature-based solutions, but then they're sort of not deemed to be acceptable because suddenly you're meeting a neutral target rather than a net zero target. So then that gives organizations the excuse to do absolutely nothing, and that is inexcusable. We do need to finance these avoided emission REDD+ projects. We do need to create the economics behind them so that the communities are incentivized not to cut down the forest, to protect all the other biodiversity benefits that they bring, as illustrated by COVID, which has really highlighted the fact that sustainability is really important. And it seems like we want to make these grand statements, but we're not willing to pay for it. We're not willing to pay nature for the public good that it is providing to us. And so we make grand statements, but we expect others to do it. And sometimes it feels a bit like, I don't know, we sort of always have this debate here in the UK where, you're going to have a cell phone mast because we live in the country and you don't have good enough reception. You want the benefit of the technology, but you don't want it in your backyard. You want it in somebody else's backyard. Let somebody else, deal with the problem. And we actually, we are responsible for doing it, and we are all responsible for doing it.
Thank you, Alan. I think we're close to the end, and so we just have time. I wanted to finish with a little game or a little exercise, so maybe bear with me 1 second. So I'm going to ask, because I think it'd be great to find ways for the four. There's so much commonality in what you're trying to do. So I'm going to ask three of you what you could do to help the fourth. All right, so my first, Anna, Damien, and Rob. And please keep it under like 30 seconds or like super quick. Who should Mindy give a pep talk to? I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, so who should Mindy give a pep talk to? Was that the question? I missed it.
Yes, that is the question. Essentially, is there a CEO or someone out there that needs Mindy to on climates to them? She could probably call that person right after the session. It's not a theoretical question.
Okay, I would like Mindy to give a pep talk to the Asset Owners Alliance or the ICGG to sort of say that, offsets are a good thing, and that avoided emissions are a good thing, and that they should be supported and supportive of them and backing them.
Yeah, I would go in a different direction. I want Mindy with access to some social media influencers, the TikTokers and the Instagram crowd, because I think her body of work and thought process in the hands of young people under 16 with millions of followers would have more impact than talking to a world leader.
Yeah, I would just quickly. I think if Mindy had conversations with the CEOs or managing partners of big law firms or accounting firms or the service providers to many of those out there, to convince them that they should probably be advising their clients to take this sort of thing seriously, or there may be consequences. I think that would be good as well.
I knew this would be fun. Okay, the next one, Mindy, Damien. This is an easy one. Who should Rob sue?
Oh.
I'm taking notes.
ExxonMobil is everybody's favorite company to hate, and for good reason. but I'll send him a very long list.
Look forward to it, Mindy.
Yeah, no,
This is dangerous
sorry.
territory,
if I'm
Henry.
putting you on the spot, you can keep it general. Any industry. I mean, there's some pretty easy ones, right? Private prisons. I vote for private prisons.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Mm.
Anna, any thoughts?
Corrupt governments.
Corrupt governments.
Corrupt governments.
Just have to find the right courts, Robin.
They have a way of using their own courts to to find favorable outcomes, but we'll think about it.
Okay, the next one is to help Rob, Damien, Mindy, any thoughts on specific forests or natural environments where Anna could put money to work to protect an ecosystem that's...
So Anna, I think what you're doing is extraordinarily important. I think right now every business and every investor are talking about offsets as part of their journey to getting to net zero. Most of them don't know a good offset from a bad offset. Excuse me, many of them are going to invest in offsets that don't help a darn thing, but they'll invest in planting a tree. How you get the word out that you have a gold standard, and I'm happy to go offline and talk with you about it. They need to know this is the biggest opportunity of their lifetime. No one's going to get to net zero just by reducing their emissions. They were going to need some offsets. We are at the exact moment when we get 10 calls a week saying, what's a good offset? What's a bad offset? Let's make sure that the literally tens of billions of dollars that will go into offsets are spent being additive and not subtracting from the journey.
Thank you, and I'd love to take that up offline with you after this.
And Rob, any other... I know Anna's mostly focused on Africa and tropical forests, but I don't know if you have any thoughts from your work.
I'm sure Anna knows. Anna must know the right ones to protect. I mean, unfortunately, England cut down most of their forests a few hundred years ago, so I don't have too many close to hand.
Okay, and then finally, maybe go ahead.
Anna, I was just going to point out, Anna gets tagged, pun intended, with talking about trees, but I think she would also point out they're human beings who live in a lot of these natural environments, and there are distinct communities that are impacted by what's taking place. Holding up those communities and recognizing what's happening to them, in addition to what's happening to the global environment, is really important. I think especially about South America, where there's some historic communities that are being devastated by what's taking place, and also aren't well known globally. So this is about people.
Damien,
and
I
trees.
completely agree with you. That's sort of the point that we're trying to get across, is that by creating a commercially viable commodity from the production that these trees are giving off, carbon credits, and that goes to the communities, and it gives them a form of of livelihood. And the higher we can drive those prices, then the more sort of revenues that end up going to those communities, and encourages development, education, etc. That's the really important part as well. It's not just the climate dimension.
Maybe jumping on that last, if you think of ways in which we can support Damien. Damien's on a mission to create thousands of jobs, people of color, make thousands of and really empower people of color across America and beyond. Do you have thoughts, Mindy, Anna, Rob, on how how you can support those efforts with your own work and with your own networks.
Well, one thing I would say, and this is a little US centric, and I apologize for my global colleagues. I think the Build Back Better $2 trillion or so proposal before the United States Congress speaks to the issues that we are all talking about, the issues of values, of housing, of equity, of good jobs and clean jobs, of climate change. I think this is our shot. This is our opportunity. It's going to take some extra taxing of corporate America, but this is the right formula. It's not perfect. There is no perfect formula, but we've got a shot right this minute. And we need to bring our communities together. This isn't about the climate community or the housing community or the environmental justice community or the labor community. It really is about all of us together. And we'll win if we're together, and we'll lose if we're all just jockeying for one small piece, rather than this is a package about the future of our country.
Thank you, Mindy. I think so I'm getting a lot coming up saying I'm going over time. So I want to really thank the four of you for joining this conversation. It's really been inspiring to me personally, and I hope it's been inspiring and helpful to everyone else in the audience. Let's make sure we continue working together on, the four of you are doing unique and important things. And I know you need a ton of support in the coming weeks and months to get a number of these things across the finish line. So I hope we can all come together as a community and help you accomplish these important objectives.
Very much.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.